Our third session today now examines local distribution. You know, we started with generation, we went to transmission, and now the next progression is to local distribution. This is where buildings meet the grid. And on this slide, you know, you can see the overall context of what we're dealing with local distribution. Our peak demand in New York City last year was 10,800 megawatts. It's a little bit higher when you factor in Westchester, but just in New York City, that's our peak demand. We do have building level resources, but we have a long, long way to go. We have 9.3 megawatts of battery storage that's installed in New York City today. Then we have thermal storage. There's question marks here because we know it's important. We know it's there. It's not measured today, so we can't quantify it, but it plays an equally important role. Then there's 213 megawatts of building solar level generation at the building site, and another 494 megawatts of demand response capacity. So this is the issues related to the local grid plus more. We put together a really diverse panel to speak to many different views on this. So let's jump right into it. I'm really pleased to introduce Charlotte Matthews. Charlotte is the Director of Sustainability for Sidewalk Labs. And so Charlotte, turn on your camera and we'll turn it over to you to take it away.
Wonderful. Well, hello everyone out in TV land. Welcome to the lower level of Harlem. I am thrilled to be getting to have this conversation. We have followed the electron down from generation to transmission to now here into our homes through the Con Ed distribution grid. And what I want to talk about with this formidable panel is what electrification is going to mean to Con Ed's distribution grid in terms of investment and cost, knowing that all the cost, all that increase in investment that Con Ed needs to make eventually comes down to the utility bills of you and me and millions of other New Yorkers. So we anticipate more investment because we're going to expand the capacity of the system to accommodate the increase in demand. We're anticipating more rooftop solar. We have to manage all that variability of solar power and offshore wind, and ensure that the high reliability we expect from Con Ed is maintained, particularly now that we're relying on it for heating, hot water, and all of our mobility. So again, the opportunity here is vast to reduce the carbon of our energy supply, but we need to think about how to minimize the cost of that, the level of new investment. And so my panel is representing the Con Ed distribution planner, the real estate owner, as well as the building controls, and the expertise of someone in batteries. So with that, let me introduce them by name. Damian Ciano, who is Director of Distribution Planning for Con Ed, truly the heart of the matter. He's responsible for planning the integration of distributed energy resources into the local grid. We have Dan Steingart, who is co-director of Columbia University's Electrochemical Energy Center. So he researches energy storage and batteries in buildings and the grid. And John Gilbert, COO of Rudin Management Company, who represents real estate management and ownership, development in both residential and commercial, as well as Rudin founded a building controls company called Prescriptive Data, who has a flagship product called Nantum. So thank you all for joining. I am thrilled to get into this conversation. Damian, I'm going to start with you. So John showed that Con Ed's current peak demand for New York City is 10,800 megawatts. How much do you expect that peak demand will grow as we start to electrify all new construction and any major retrofits of heating and hot water? And if I can add one more question to that, if all things being equal, how much of an increase in investment spending year over year would that represent for you?
Good morning. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Charlotte. Let me give a short answer because then I'm going to follow it with a very long answer. But Local Law 97 and the Community Leadership Climate Protection Act are going to be transformational to the distribution system. So I anticipate the grid of tomorrow will look very different from today. And secondly, we do have a lot of tools from REV, and you're going to hear me talk about that in my longer answer. But we look at the benefit cost analysis. So we're taking a more holistic view of the costs and benefits to society as a whole. And because we do have a good amount of time to kind of plan this and build this out, even though it's very transformational, we're obviously going to do our best to streamline that and optimize it as much as possible. So whatever costs are put in, we have some offsetting savings and benefits. So with that, I'll launch into the longer answer. Just for a framework for everybody, I know a lot of people know Con Edison system, and you might be thinking, isn't their peak load 13,200 megawatts? It is. That includes Westchester. But when you take that piece out, you get to the 11,000 megawatts. Just kind of wanted to get that so everyone's on the same page. And I think Urban Green did a really good job of setting this up, because I think the first two speakers focused on the 2030 goals and the 2040 goals, right? Initially, we're greening the sourcing. And to make a gross simplification, it would be possible to reach the 70% 2030 goal and the 100% clean green energy goal of 2040 through large-scale renewables and increased infrastructure design. So that's an oversimplification. It's that 2050 goal of converting all gasoline-driven vehicles to electric vehicles and taking all gas boilers and propane boilers and oil boilers and providing them through electricity and through heat pumps or some kind of geothermal heat pump. So that's the one that's really transformational to the distribution system and is going to drive a tremendous amount of growth. We've seen numbers as much as 2 to 3 times. I'm not going to be advocating for that in this particular thing. I think I'll explain why it'll be somewhere lower than that. So that in my mind is the two different pieces of Local Law 97 and the CLCPA. I am focused on the distribution side. I've spent the last 6 years under Reforming the Energy Vision, REV, doing my best to help integrate energy efficiency, solar, energy storage, non-wire solutions, microgrids to kind of keep the growth down. And even though I made that oversimplification, the next 10 and 20 years are going to have tremendous amounts more of distributed energy resources like rooftop solar, of which there's already like 25,000 in New York City, electric vehicles, electric heat pumps. So we're doing that now. I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression. There's going to be transformation on the distribution side right away. But the initial phase of greening is going to be more on that large-scale renewables. And my focus is going to be on meeting customer needs, helping supplement and complement those large-scale renewables, and adding in resiliency and great operational flexibility and things along those lines. It's that 2050 goal that I've got to transform my system and work with people like John Gilbert and the building owners to help meet what could be dramatically more load. So I suspect a lot of the people that are listening are already familiar with the Eppy Electrification study. And what that study did was it looked at the two new forms of electrification, right? So to again, simplify grossly, hopefully not too grossly, but that 11,000 megawatt peak in New York City, the impact of 100% penetration of electric vehicles by 2050 could increase that by, say, 30%. The big driver is if you convert all these boilers over to heat pumps, that could double and conceivably triple the loading. So both are big impacts, but the heating is really the one that's driving it. The heating is the one we know the least about, actually, to be honest with you. Even under the trajectory we were under, which was pretty aggressive under REV, we were already looking at 70, 80, 90% penetration of electric vehicles in just 10 short years. Forget about 30 years.
All right.
So we're kind of...
And I'm going to anticipate that, Con Ed's distribution grid is really sized for your current demand. And so this 2 to 3 times increase could be a significant increase in the rate of investment you're making. Dan, we heard from Damien that batteries and solar are part of that solution. And John's slide again says we've got about 9 megawatts of battery in buildings today and maybe 250 megawatts of solar, all against this current peak of 10,800 that could be 2 to 3 times bigger once we have electrification. How big would you want to see those numbers? And do you think that's the solution?
So thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm an academic, so I don't get paid to do anything that anyone really depends on. So take what I'm saying with a significant grain of salt. That said, I've been working for the last decade on batteries that fit into grid scale storage. Initially, ideas of 2 to 4 hour storage, simply displacing peakers. This new local law, as Damien just pointed out, really changes the game, and I'm trying to wrap my head around everything it means, and I'll get to that in a second. I think that look, if we have decided that we are not going to invest more in nuclear in the short term. Regardless of the correctness of that decision, I won't get into that here, but it means that batteries have to take up the base load if we're going to be reliant upon wind and solar. And I don't know the level of hydro that's going to be pumped down or brought down, but I suspect that even with that, the amount of battery electric storage will have to get to about 10 hours of duration across the whole system. The fact that we are looking at not just electric vehicles, that was my big bugaboo before nuclear was pushed out of the picture. Now the electric vehicles plus the heating load basically means that we need 10 to 20 hours of battery electric storage.
10 to 20 hours, you mean like Con Ed has to have 10 or 20 hours available to meet the whole grid, or are you talking about per building?
Well, so in a perfect world, and these are the types of batteries I think about academically, it would be per building, but I don't think it's fair or equitable to expect buildings to do it anytime soon. So this is the difference between 2025, 2030, and 2050. In 2050, if the grid is distributed in such a way that we have an internet of energy where local arbitrage happens instantaneously and energy is transferred like data is transferred now in a peer-to-peer network, that would be fantastic. But we want to get to these targets faster. We don't have until 2050 to begin the greening. And so I think it's incumbent upon NYSERDA and Con Ed and everyone that controls the grid now to make sure that the greenness, not just for CO2 emissions, but for other particulate emissions, goes across the income spectrum. And so I think it's important that the energy's installed, the batteries are installed somewhere. And right now that means that Con Ed within New York is taking the responsibility for it.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that based on how we price electricity today, unlikely that it's economically rational for buildings to really pick up the majority of the battery storage that you think needs to be on the grid, and you would advise that Con Ed should be making those investments.
I think so. Yeah. That's fair. Yeah.
And in terms of solar rooftop penetration, is that a material benefit to the grid, a material detriment to the grid, immaterial?
I think that I'm going to say something challenging here. I think it's like DirecTV in the sense that it makes it people aware that it exists and that it can have some impact. Now, whether or not it needs to be on people's roofs or at some site somewhere that people are comfortable with the investment of is a separate question. I think that first we have to have the resources replacing current assets, and then we can worry about the distribution, right? So I'm going to give you a very hedging answer to say, first we have to replace current generation and distribution centrally, and then we can worry about making it distributed.
Okay, so what I heard from that to translate is that you're thinking utility scale solar, big wing, rooftop solar, frosting on the cake, more for
that's right.
Than material.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So John, what's your take? I mean, Dan here has said that it doesn't make sense economically yet for buildings to install batteries. I don't know what you think of that. And are there other load shifting, like other ways of moving your drawing from the grid at nighttime and using that power during the day that you can think of as a building owner or a controls company?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's really important that we really look at the battery storage question. As we look at the the generation or new power, green power coming into the city, whether it's Champlain Hudson, which the advantage there obviously is base load, or if we look at wind, which is going to be an intermittent load, then we need to store that somehow. We need to ultimately put that in a place where we can use it when demand is high and plug it in or grab it when demand is low. So the resiliency of the grid, the ability of property owners ultimately to see and understand both the supply and demand parameters will be hugely important. Managing their data, understanding real-time demand metrics and real-time supply metrics, and ultimately to be able to put that power someplace where it can be used when demand is low. So we're very much in favor of on-site battery storage. We're obviously we need to find the space. Most of our buildings' rooftops are already filled with mechanical equipment. So we're looking at putting it other places and trying to squirrel away as much space as we possibly can to be able to do that. I think the physics of battery storage need to change. We need to look at, obviously, the fire department of the city of New York is not real happy with property owners who want to put these batteries, especially if they're lithium, into the buildings. So we need to understand the physics of those batteries. We need to change or at least modify the type of batteries that we use so that they're not flammable and that they don't cause safety issues ultimately for the people who either live or work in our buildings.
So I'm hearing from you that actually you think building owners have to be part of the solution of installing batteries. And it sounds like you've already done some of that. So you're making the economics work, but obviously making them even better would be better. Out of curiosity, not to put you on the spot, but what if New York City did require all new construction to be electric, and even maybe went so far as saying every major retrofit of a heating system has to be electric? I'm gonna give you those questions that follow up, but I do want people from the audience to start putting down their questions, so I'm just gonna put that note. But John.
Sure. I think Damien really outlined the issue, which is all how do we replace those BTUs that are currently used for heating multifamily residential? We've looked at heat pump technologies. We own a lot of buildings that are pre-war buildings. To be able to retrofit those buildings and put in heat pumps and to replace those steam radiators is hugely invasive and hugely expensive. That for sure is uneconomical, far more uneconomical than any type of battery storage. On the commercial office side, I think you can play, that's a better play there. But I think what we really need to understand is from an electrification standpoint, if the numbers that Damien threw out there, which 2-3x of what we have right now in terms of peak, what we also do is we move our peak from the summer to the winter. The horrible, terrible that we worry about in terms of a winter peak is that if the lights go out in the summer, nobody freezes to death. No buildings ultimately have frozen pipes that burst and that are deemed useless for the future. In a winter peak, that's definitely that can happen. I've always been taught from an energy standpoint that resiliency equals diversity, and ultimately source energy diversity is hugely important, as well as distribution, because that distribution network ultimately is what brings those electrons to our properties. And if you don't have diversity in that, if you've got all your eggs in one basket, then, the propensity or, the management of that risk becomes much, much more complicated.
Yeah, I certainly hear you on that. But I know you're also, because of the work you've done, a true environmentalist who was worried about climate change. So on new construction, considering you could address a large portion of the risk of losing heating in the design of the envelope. And there are other ways of having backup power, as we well know. Diesel, I mean, we're not getting rid of all fossil fuels, but maybe gas. Could you be supportive of new construction being all electric?
We need to really make sure that the technology, that heat pump technology, actually is scalable and it works. On the office side, I could be in favor of that. I've still got reservations on the multifamily residential side.
Totally understood. I'm going to bring it back to you, Damien, at this point, that to the extent that building owners were to install batteries and do other load shifting techniques, reduce their peak demand, is Con Ed's business aligned with buildings reducing their peak demand, or, in fact, more is more for you guys? Like, would you materially change your investment if buildings started reducing their peak demand as we moved into electrification?
Right. No, I think the old utility model was certainly selling more and making more money because you could rate base more product. But over the last few decades, we've literally decoupled our electric revenues from the amount of electricity used. And then the second piece of that under REV was we've got a lot more incentives to try to offset buildings with non-wire solutions in particular. So, one of the biggest victories there, and I mean, we've got national recognition for this, was avoiding building $1 billion worth of infrastructure by incentivizing customers to put in energy efficiency, energy storage. A little less on the energy storage because that was a couple of years ago, but we think that'll be more and more a piece of that. Cells and some other things. So we just see a lot more of that model going off to help us meet these growing needs. I think there's also going to be some new, state-of-the-art substations. I'm sure microgrids will play a role in that, and I am a huge fan of energy storage. And to quote one of the other speakers, Mr. Jasom and the other panel, the problem is so big, especially for the energy storage. It's got to be an all of the above approach. So I see everything from customer-owned batteries in buildings and houses and garages, using the electric vehicles as batteries, to utility-owned batteries, and to bulk batteries. I think we're going to need all of the above.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is everyone is on the same page about this, that the more buildings do, the more energy and energy storage developers do, Con Ed, everyone is benefiting from reducing the cost impact of expanding capacity and other such things.
Yeah.
So Dan, you were concerned about the sort of economics of batteries today for building owners, but can you tell us how much the GHG intensity of power differs day to night in New York City, and if there are at least environmental benefits from installing batteries and taking the load shifting behaviors that building owners can point to?
So I can't emphasize enough that this is in a world where you're not doing heat pumps, right? We're talking about right now. And the answer is absolutely yes. If building owners are doing 1 to 4 hour arbitrage to displace peaker plants and to fight the demand charge, then that has significant GHG benefit, even in a world where there's not that much renewable generation because of the nature of the base load. Right, so peaker plants are just less efficient from a GHG point of view than base load plants, at least modern ones. When you're comparing gas to gas, and coal is minimized. So in a world where we're not doing a day-night, rather we're not doing this electrification of everything, and we're currently supporting the kind of summer peaks we just heard about, then batteries can have a big impact on GHG. Once you make everything electric, you have to make sure that you supply meets demand, and I think that's what the three of us on this panel are really worried about in every way, right? So all of this is really chump change in comparison to this all electric push on consumption and non-fossil fuel push on supply.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is we really first and foremost have to green the grid.
Yeah. I mean, if I can be blunt about it, that's a question for 10 years ago, right? I mean, just to be sort of mean and blunt about it, that's the 10-year ago question. We could have pushed for that 10 years ago, and we didn't. So now we're in a different position.
But presumably, what I'm hearing is basically where we stand today. Batteries help reduce exposure to the peaking plants that are the big,
right,
ugly, dirty. But as we green the grid, the GHG intensity of each hour will start to differ more, and batteries might have more of a play as we go.
Right.
John, Local Law 97, which is trying to change the economics of energy conservation and really try and reduce this peak demand. It doesn't, for instance, include any changing variable that recognizes the changing GHG intensity of power. So it's not giving owners a bigger win when they reduce exposure to these peaker plants. What are your thoughts on Local Law 97? And as it enters into the rulemaking stage, are there small tweaks that you can imagine to make it better or great as it is?
Well, I think when you look at the energy pie of a typical office building, let's focus on office. Roughly, owners control about 40% of that load, and our customers, our tenants, control about 60% of that. The way that this law was laid out, and I think it was, these are smart people, it was well-intentioned, but we left the 60% of the problem off the table and gave the responsibility for controlling consumption of that 60% of the problem, i.e. our tenants, to the people who only control 40% of the problem. That, if that's allowed to stay, there's no way we can possibly succeed in reaching these goals. To simply fine people for something that's somebody else's responsibility, that we know that just never works. It just doesn't work. So in my mind, you talk about carbon intensity. Carbon intensity changes by the hour and by the season. And it's a function, what we have to understand is that most of the buildings that will run into trouble, and when I mean trouble, will pay fines in 2024, are the buildings that aren't operated 9 to 5. Those buildings are operated from 6 o'clock in the morning till midnight. Why? Because the customers, the tenants inside those buildings are monitoring global markets, so that they need to be awake when London is awake, and they need to be awake when Singapore is awake. So that continuum mandates that ultimately property owners, because of the contracts that we sign with these customers, provide them with conditioned air with comfort, HVAC, for that entire period. So if we really want to remain the city that never sleeps, then this law ultimately has to take into consideration and understand the occupancy of these buildings. As we know, we've just gone through, with COVID-19. What was amazing is the office sector in the city of New York only consumed 30%, just under 30% less power, less electricity, when our buildings were basically empty. Now we ask ourselves, why? Well, the reason for that is for all of us working from home, the infrastructure that allows us to work from home actually lives in our buildings. So we have not shut down our office buildings. Everybody says, oh, you're reopening. I'm like, no, we're not reopening. We're reoccupying. We have never shut down. And so that 30% savings is a big number, but ultimately my instincts were it was much, much larger. So we need to focus on occupancy. We need to focus ultimately on what is the solution to the problem we're really trying to solve. and to engage all the stakeholders who are participating in that. I know in conversations that I have with our customers, our big customers, they all want to be part of this solution. And the big issue, I think, the other piece that I just want to throw in here, Charlotte, is, okay, let's say I'm a property owner. Big tenant comes to me and says, hey, I want you to go buy renewable energy. I can't buy it today. It doesn't exist today for all the reasons that have been talked about this morning. The governor 25 minutes ago, half hour, says phase 2 is hitting Monday, June 22nd. Okay, well, how am I going to buy those renewables? We're back in business. We're reoccupying. And ultimately, what is the process? What is that end-to-end process from supply to demand? Is there a blockchain in between there that allows me ultimately to have an immutable ledger that allows me to ultimately go out and buy those green electrons and then distribute that back to the customers that exist within my buildings? That's a very, very important aspect of this that I don't think too many people are thinking about.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm hearing is local law 97, yes, GHG intensity of the power grid should vary, but actually much more important than that is looking at how occupancy is varying and what the true schedule of a building is. And ideally, if the policy starts looking at that, things like big servers inside of buildings, there would be a push to pull those out because you're realizing these buildings are not occupied, but are still having to be supported. And that also there needs to be a way to get commercial tenants involved. And there was sort of a plug there I heard at the end for maybe a GHG carbon trading platform of some kind to allow buildings to offset those emissions that they can't avoid. I'm going to focus now on some audience questions that quite rightly are asking, why are we talking about electric storage? Why aren't we talking about battery storage or even the thermal inertia of buildings and how they can participate? To whom should Dan, is that a question you can answer, or who feels?
Sure.
Good.
What is the question? I don't see the question on my screen.
Well, you might not get that, Virtue. The question
okay.
is, why so much focus on battery storage instead of thermal storage? How can thermal storage participate? And is there a way that buildings can act more as a thermal damper or a thermal battery into themselves?
So the long answer is a semester-long course called thermodynamics, where it has to do with the amount of mass that you're willing to spend on thermal storage and the kind of thermal storage. As a reservoir, having let's say there's excess supply, and so something that's been noticeably absent from this conversation, I want to point out that's different from a similar panel that would be in California right now, is excess supply. People in California talk about this nirvana of seasonal storage, right? We haven't got anywhere near that in this conversation for good reason. But if you have excess capacity, then yeah, a great thing to do with it and a cheap thing to do with it is to build more hot water heaters and store that extra electricity simply as hot water. But that water takes up volume, and those heaters are OpEx concerns. And the question is, within a constrained footprint, how much of that can you really get done? And the sad answer is a bit, but not a ton. Ice storage is something that has been used for decades, and where it works quite effectively. But again, it's a function of like simply where do you put it. And so that's the long answer is a class called thermodynamics. The short answer is that chemical bonds are very effective at storing energy, and mass is a little bit less effective. I mean, non-chemical bonds, so it's simply mechanical storage or thermal storage, simply does not have the energy density that batteries do. So I'm very biased here because I've chosen to study batteries for this very reason. Right. And I'm happy to be fought on this. But the point is that regardless of whether it's for heating use or electrical use, the energy density of a battery is what gives it a fighting chance for being either in a substation or in a building.
So what I'm hearing from you is that on sort of level of energy density or bang for the buck in terms of cost and size, that the thermal inertia of mass, which is like the building, is kind of lowest. And then you have the liquid, which is thermal storage. And then chemical, which is batteries, you get the most energy storage per square foot of stuff.
No, that's right. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm happy to be fought by the rest of the panel on this, is that coupling things is just really difficult, right? So as engineers, we like to decouple things. We don't like we have this beautiful idea of having multifunctional materials, but in terms of maintenance and in terms of installation and the way we live our lives, we like one thing to have one function. And buildings do an amazing job of having not just thermal storage, but thermal shifting, right? So if you think about buildings in the desert, they're designed specifically so that the diurnal, very hot during the day, very cold during the night, is shifted by the building mass. But they have to be very in tune with their environment, and they're not asking for this 24-hour work cycle. So we have to pick really.
An all-glass office building may not be the best.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But Charlotte, I think if I could jump in on this one, because I think it's really important to understand the concept of thermal inertia. I define thermal inertia as how quickly an individual building either heats up or cools down. And ultimately, how quickly, or how do we manage that information first? How do we ultimately grab that data? And what we use, we created Nantum for this exact example, where I can identify an individual building, and using machine learning algorithms and ultimately, artificial intelligence, I can understand exactly what my building's thermal inertia is. I can then shrink my operational day by knowing what's the latest I can start my engines and what's the earliest I can shut them off in terms of ramping down at the end of the day. And then in the middle of the day, as I track my occupancy, I can modulate fan speed as people go to lunch. Now, all of this has resulted in the energy that we control in the Rudin portfolio. I've cut my electricity by 41%, I've cut my carbon by 48%, and I've cut my steam my carbon by 44% and my steam by 48%. Simply by understanding the data that we already, every day, all day, collect and correlating that against other key variables within the building that consume electricity.
Right. So thank you, John, for making that very important point. I mean, it goes back to what Damien said at the beginning, which is it's all of the above. And while there's a great energy density from batteries, it's a new thing to add to our buildings. And right now we have buildings, and we can be using that thermal mass, if only by operating them better when we turn on these heating and cooling systems, to have a significant impact. On that note, knowing another question from the audience, knowing that a lot of commercial buildings are really in cooling all the time, is there a way to harness that cooling through a thermal grid to provide heating to a residential? And in that when you're cooling a building, you pull the heat out of that building, and that heat could be recaptured and repurposed for heating a residential building. Is that something that Con Ed could do as a utility? Is that something of value? How do you look at that, Damien? And then maybe John, I'll turn to you to the extent you'd like.
Sure. I mean, before there was all this interest around microgrids, there was interest around heating and cooling loops like you're talking about. So Con Edison has our steam system that allows you to get the benefits of cogen, which I realize have a different role under CLCPA, and share that with buildings. But it has all the challenges of interacting with the other buildings. So it's a good idea. It's just hard to scale. And I'm just saying this thing can change. And Charlotte, I apologize, but if I could just answer that other question.
Of course. Yeah, sorry if I didn't. Yeah.
No problems. From the utility perspective, the reason batteries and electric energy storage is so important right now is because all the resources you're adding to the system are amazingly green and have great environmental characteristics, but they're not dispatchable. They're intermittent resources, and you absolutely positively need that energy storage to complement. In addition to that, If you think about New York City, you got the Hudson River, you got the Long Island Sound, you got the Atlantic Ocean to the south. It's a fundamental bottleneck. The NISO has a requirement, and the New York City reliability rules have a requirement that 90% of the generation today, which is all dispatchables, almost all dispatchables, be within New York City. So of the 11,000 megawatts, almost 10,000 of them can all be generated in the city. And right now, you're going to get rid of all of them over time. And so how do you add that resiliency back? You just can't do it without energy storage. And I'm happy to answer more questions on that. But those are really important from a grid operator's point of view. I agree with all the other points.
And John or Dan, do you want to talk about thermal grids or how you think about trying to harness the heat being rejected from your commercial buildings during the winter?
I mean, the issue there is obviously how do you distribute it, right? We can grab that heat. What do we do with it after we grab it? If I've got an apartment building that, is on the same block, then clearly I could push that excess heat, basically combined heat and power systems. Cogeneration does it. We're doing that down at a project that we built on 130 West 12th Street where we've got a cogen plant. So yes, the short answer is yes, that can be done.
Well, that actually raises another question from the audience, which is, cogen was pretty hip 10 years ago, so much so that we built one at Hudson Yards. And I confess that by the time we finished it, cogen was no longer seen to be a good thing for New York City because it was putting more gas-based infrastructure. Yeah. The reality is that our grid is still gas, and therefore you're improving the efficiency of the system by at least twice with massive carbon benefit. What is the opinion of this group? Is there still a role for cogen in selected places in New York City, or is that 20-year or 25-year life cycle just too long?
So if I can jump in, because this is a question I ask when I teach thermo. Why don't we take the waste heat from our refrigerator and pump it into our to preheat our hot water heater, right? So because from a energy and energy use point of view, it makes all the sense in the world. It really comes down to the amortizing the capital cost of that coupling and figuring out what the payback period is. So the answer to the question just asked is, in a new project, if energy flows are carefully thought out and directed, one can, even in an electric grid, take the waste heat and the waste processes and do some clever things with them. And so cogen is always good because regardless of the source, you're taking inherent irreversibilities in waste heat and putting them to some use. But it's very hard to do after the fact. It's very, right? And so the way we like to build things is that we have contractor A come in, they do this, contractor B comes in and does that. The general contractor schedules it for time and budgetary reasons, and each one of those subcontractors organizes their own schedules to have these jobs. So now to sort of say you guys have to, or you folks have to come in and couple your behaviors so that we can get this building to be extra green. Well, that is a person hour cost. That's outside of my scope of understanding, but basically that's why we don't have refrigerators, which every house has, coupled into hot water heaters, which most houses do have.
Thank you. Damien and John, do you generally agree that there's a role still for cogen, or would one of you like to counter?
I mean, I'll jump in. It's no secret that Con Edison also owns the gas system. So, obviously I have a bias towards that. And I worked for a cogen developer back in the late 90s, and we did feel like we were the one leading the green charge. So we think there's a role for gas. We think there's things we can do to green it. There's a it's being called renewable natural gas, where you recover, from landfill sites or from some kind of food sourcing and things like that. To me, that's like kind of an ethanol solution where maybe you can get as much as 10%, greener gas. There's future hopes for injecting some hydrogen in there. And then, I know it's become an unpopular term, but there's still this 30-year bridge that we're talking about. And I certainly feel that there's a role there, and we want to be thoughtful about it. At the end of the day, Con Edison does work for the customers and the people we serve. So we're going to serve whatever they want. And we just want to do it, get to that goal as fast as possible. And again, I think gas definitely does have a role, especially in the short term.
Great. Couple questions I'm going to combine for you, John, which was, it seems like buildings really, based on your example of that, they're now currently unoccupied or commercial buildings, and they're just using 30% less. There's still a big opportunity to get buildings to be more efficient, better operated. But question for you from the audience is, what could policy or rates or what other lever points would make that level of retrofit more economic for you? And how much did actually the tenant leases require you to operate the building in this way? And is that the big area of innovation?
Well, I'll give you a great example. We have a major tenant at one of our buildings, and we began to work with them to provide them with very granular data. And what we gave them was floor-by-floor occupancy data, as well as electrical consumption data. And they came back to us and said, why are you giving me conditioned air at conditioned space at 7 o'clock in the morning, when you're showing me from an occupancy standpoint that my people aren't showing up until 8:45? And the short answer was, well, that's what you negotiated for when we signed the lease. Well, we don't want it anymore. Do not give us that level of comfort at 7 o'clock in the morning when no one's in the building. And we're like, beautiful. That's an amazing, let's amend the lease, which we did. The second question, they said, now why are you giving me conditioned space on all of my floors from 9 o'clock on Saturday to 1 o'clock in the afternoon? Same answer, because you negotiated that, you wanted that for your people. Well, we're going to create some hot desking floors and just give us that on Saturdays from 9 to 1 on 2 floors, not the whole 16 floors. So the short answer to that is, the more granular data we can grab and the more opportunity that we get to share that with our customers, the more efficiencies that we can create. And we can really attack that 60% of the problem that currently isn't engaged. So, people say, well, data is the new oil. I'm like, yeah, but it's crude oil, and you need software to refine it. And unless you have that software, that single integrated platform that allows you to synthesize this crude oil, make it valuable, share it with your customers, and thus decrease the amount of electricity that we're consuming, then you're really not doing your job. So to me, it's really all about, we need more granular data. We need software systems like Nantum that ultimately refines it and then turns it around and make it actionable, so that we really can make our buildings more efficient.
John, I want to follow up on that, in that Rudin is a leader as real estate, using technology to improve your buildings, and you've made a big investment into a building controls company to scale that. However, I personally left 10 years in real estate, 20 years, and went to a technology company because real estate did not seem to be making the investments into looking at how buildings were actually performing and using that to improve their operation. So recognizing that you are a little bit of like the golden child on this one, what do you think the city or regulators could do to drive the rest of the industry to use data in the way that you're suggesting, and also for tenants to value it?
Yeah, I think, the conversation really has to be, let's define what the problem is, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to fill up a bucket, and the bucket's got a hole in the bottom. And ultimately, we need to plug that hole. I think very simplistically, the answer to this bigger question that this entire morning has been about is about figuring out ways to use less and to make more. And what we make more of has to be green, and the use less is all about building efficiency. So I think we have to really grab, and I know you're really focused on this, Charlotte, which is, we have to understand that occupancy as a variable, both for greenhouse gas and carbon intensity, as well as the deliverable the delivery, for delivering a product using the least amount of energy possible is essential. You cannot do it. How many people have come back from lunch and their office is absolutely freezing? And the reason for that is that the same amount of volumetric air that's been conditioned and used an enormous amount of electricity to chill that space has been blowing through that entire lunch period when no one's in the building and that heat load has walked out.
Yeah.
If we simply just adjust that and create, rather than a classic bell-shaped curve of consumption, we now have a double-humped camel. And that divot in the middle of the day, every single building in New York is able to save that simply by correlating two data sets that they're already collecting.
So
that's where we need to go.
So what you might hate me for saying is it sounds like a local law 97 that changes the economics of not doing these investments with an occupancy factor that actually starts driving buildings to see when waste is occurring could be a hammer or a stick. I think the stick. We don't put the hammer on. A couple of fun and very smart comments coming out from the audience. One is that the sewer system is a great thermal grid. And certainly that's what we were planning to use as Sidewalk Labs in our project. It's very popular in Canada. So that's something to think about. And to the extent that we have data centers in New York City, which is, of course, an expensive site for real estate, but that's obviously a big heat gain win. Well, I think we have time for you all to sort of say your last bit. Is there anything that you wanted to offer to the audience or that I didn't get to cover? Damien, we'll go around, not to put you on the spot, but.
No worries. I should have also mentioned our AMI initiative, automatic meter information that's about 2/3 rolled out already, is going to help provide some of that customer insight that John mentioned. So that's the one thing I would add. We're making a lot of foundational investments in our grid. And then just on a closing note, I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm extremely optimistic about the future. So even though, we see a lot of thought that's got to go, I think we've all got to be very thoughtful about this. I think you've heard that. I don't think that's skepticism. I know when I got ready to run a marathon 20 years ago, it was nice to hear my mother say, "You got it, you're going to do it." But it was much more useful to hear the guy that did it already explain all the things I had to train and tell me I was behind the schedule, et cetera. And so I hope this comes across as that person. I see a tremendous opportunity. I'm very hopeful for technology, and I'd never bet against the young people today and the smart people that we're surrounded by. So I'm very excited for the future.
Thank you. Dan, in 30 seconds, last words.
Sure. I think Damien and John hit it on the head that it's hard to change physics, but one can push the physics of where batteries are. And so I'll give a plug for what we're doing. We're actively working on both cycle life and safety aspects of batteries so that you're not afraid to put them in every nook and cranny. As John said, it's hard to put them in basements, it's hard to put them on roofs, but there are other places where you can fit a substantial amount of energy storage. I think this is a very New York leading problem, so I think it would be great if NYSERDA wanted to put a little bit more effort into funding the fundamentals of exactly pushing these physics. It's a great idea.
And John, 1 minute left. I'm going to let you thank the panel and just say your closing remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you, Charlotte. And I could never find any reason to hate you. So even if you tried to put words into my mouth, I could never do that. I think the short answer is we've got this. We can figure this out. And I think, let's get the Champlain Hudson built. Let's get the offshore wind underway and get the permitting done. And let's focus on delivering green electrons into the city of New York and Zone J.
Perfect.
Let's get there.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Charlotte.
You.
Okay, Charlotte, Dan, Damien, John, thank you so much for that great panel. And wow, what a day. Thank you to our moderators. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you for joining us. This is our largest conference ever at Urban Green, and it's all because of you. Thank you for making it such a great success. And I also want to thank our sponsor, Carrier, for supporting the event. I hope we accomplished the goal that we set out to today, which was to connect the dots and bridge the divide so we all have a common understanding on where we're going with the grid. I certainly learned a lot. I hope you did too. Now, before I say goodbye, I want to announce two big things coming up at Urban Green that you may find of interest. First, next week, look for the release of Urban Green's newest major report on building carbon trading. Charlotte mentioned this issue already. We've spent the last year looking at this issue, and we're ready to issue a report next week that looks at this breakthrough policy tool for carbon reduction. And the report identifies 59 policy options that New York City and cities around the world can consider as this policy tool. It's a major effort on our part. So take a look at the report next week when it comes out. Next, I bring up a slide here, and I'm excited to announce another episode of Urban Green Live coming up. This, as you know, I had mentioned earlier, this is our live video podcast series, and we're excited to have the chairman and CEO of the MTA, Pat Foy, will be on as my guest coming up at the end of July. Obviously, this is a pivotal decision maker in New York, not only about reopening New York, but also about the future sustainability of the MTA and the role it plays in New York. So we look forward to having Dan on the program. This is in addition to, as I mentioned earlier, that on July 8th, we're going to have Sophie Brochu, who's the CEO of Hydro-Quebec, also on Urban Green Live. So let me just wrap up and say this is the end of our conference. I hope you can see that Urban Green is taking on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions to make the biggest difference. Today is a really good example of what we do, and we're so grateful that you spent the time with us. Thank you very much, and have a great day.